Hello and welcome back. LinkedIn and YouTube, we are streaming to this afternoon. It's been a minute. I hope everyone's summer holidays aren't too much of a distant memory. And I hope that we're also holding off the intake of the school germs, which I would like to say isn't the case in my household, unfortunately. As you can see, today I'm not alone. I'm joined by the incredible Gary Ford, co-founder of Men for Inclusion. And I'm sure, we will talk through lots of the reasons that Gary and I started working together and getting to know each other. But the reason that I wanted to invite Gary on to have this conversation today is because so many of the clients that we work with at Talent Included are facing so many challenges when it comes to the publicly announced gender targets that they've announced out there, but real challenges as to why they're not working, why we're not hitting those targets, why the interventions and the programs that we've got set up aren't kind of hitting the mark. And so I gave Gary a call, said, please come on and talk about this. He said, why not? And also very aptly named this session, what got us here won't got us there. And so during the next 45 minutes, we're going to be exploring that. We're going to be talking about why these gender initiatives are falling short, the importance of the male voice and the male experience to try and tackle some of that, and what essentially lasting kind of change transformation look like. And also, as you always know, it's going to be peppered with some practical and tactical things that we can all take away and embed within our organisation. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass over to you, Gary. I'd love to hear who you are, where you're from. It's a very blind date, isn't it? Who you are, where you're from, a brief overview for Men for Inclusion, because I know that we're going to do a deep dive on that later in the session. And also something that I know is very important to you in terms of a conversation starter is why, where has this pivot to inclusion come from and what inclusion means to us? So over to you.
Thanks, Sally. Really good to be here. Thank you again for inviting me. So Gary Ford, probably the real short version, 3 things to know about me. I am a former managing director of JP Morgan Chase within the global technology division. I co-founded their Male Allies program for women in technology. And I also wrote a book about that experience alongside Stephen Kosh and Dr. Jill Armstrong called The Accidental Sexist, which talks about the experience of trying to set up that Male Allies program. And I set Men for Inclusion up about 3 years ago with my business partner, Mark Freed. And I guess the reason why I think we exist is we are a diversity and inclusion consulting company. I think our focus is on inclusive leadership, and clearly one of our USPs, hence the name of the company, is trying to encourage more men into this conversation. Not because it's about supporting lots of other people, but because it's also about helping them get better at what they do.
Love that. Fantastic. And talk to us about this, move from, if you like, diversity to inclusion, because I think diversity is sometimes really misunderstood. I think sometimes it's seen as, you're not being politically correct or you're ticking a box rather than kind of genuinely fostering inclusion. I think we still see a real kind of cultural and political divide. Mm-hmm. I think diversity, prods the stick at, there's a perceived threat to meritocracy. I think so many people fear change, and I know that we're going to talk about change in a lot more detail later, but the change and if we use the word diversity, it seems so triggering. So talk to me about this kind of pivot to inclusion and what you think that means for us all.
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is that, over the last how many years, 30, 50, choose your time span, I think the world of work has changed radically. And I think clearly we are seeing people from very diverse backgrounds, in really, new and interesting leadership positions. So I think the work today has been great. I think we've done lots of good things that's broken, some of the stereotypical thinking about the roles, the traditional roles of men and women in particular. However, to your point, I think things are now getting a little bit more tricky, right? And we kind of seem to have got to a level, and it seems that we can't seem to get past that. It's kind of interesting. One example would be how you've seen this huge increase in the number of women on boards in the UK, and that's lots of good work by people that have been part of the Alexander Hampton Review or the FTSE 100 Women's Leaders Programme. But a lot of those roles have been non-executive. There's still less than, I think, 10% of CEOs are women in FTSE 100 companies, and gender pay gaps that seem to be a little bit kind of stuck now, right? For a lot of industries, they're not really moving forward. And I think one of the things that I think we've recognised is that most of that work to increase representation, get more underrepresented groups, has been by the people in those underrepresented groups, right? Very little of that work has been done by the straight white male majority that still tend to make up most of the leadership positions in most kind of large companies. And I think the focus, and you called this out, the focus on diversity is beginning to feel a little bit divisive, because we structurally put all these programs in place that are advocating or sponsoring or empowering people from groups that traditionally don't found it difficult to get into leadership. That's creating a little bit of this backlash from the majority. And I think the interesting thing is that diversity is focusing on a particular characteristic. We pivot to inclusion. The inclusion part is trying to broaden that conversation to be one about all of us. We need to recognize that actually everyone has challenges, struggles with their career. Everyone has barriers. And although we've done a great job to figure out some of those barriers, particularly for women, we've got to recognize that if we're not going to fix some of the barriers for others, then they're going to begin to push back against it, right? If they see progress for others and they don't see progress for themselves, then I think that's where we're seeing some of the challenges. And this idea about inclusion is focused on where can we find solutions that work for everyone? Where can we do things that are actually beneficial to as many people as we make them beneficial to, without still losing that desire to make sure that those people that have traditionally been underrepresented, we're not putting fresh barriers in their way either.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really difficult balancing act in some ways, I feel. Sorry.
No, not at all. And I think you're right. And I think in addition to that, and I wanted to come on to male allyship shortly, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what's kind of brought me to this conversation is the work that we do around gender equity programs, the deep dive. And it was so lovely when I was preparing for this over the last couple of weeks. It was like putting a really familiar, comfy blanket back on, because I'm like, this is the stuff that, I've done the research, I've read the books, I've taken the companies through change, I've identified what the problems are. And so I think the point that you make there is so multifaceted in terms of the impact, the things that impact women not taking up these roles, or being given the opportunity to take up these roles. But equally, we need to talk about the male experience and the male experience. And it's difficult. And so I want to kind of pre-frame this with, it's difficult that when we're talking about gender equity, or the lack of gender equity and females not being in equitable positions, it's very then difficult to start saying, well, actually, we need to talk about the male experience, because the focus should, for the patriarchal world that we live in, and we can't deny that there is one. We can't deny that there is one.
Yep.
But it's very difficult to then start, well, hang on a minute. We can't tackle that because we need to talk about the male experience. But what's happening as an undercurrent throughout all of this, which is only going to make situations more complex, is if we don't talk about the male experience and address it, the gap is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's going to become more polarized, more divisive. And I think it's important that we recognize, and I say this as a female and I say this as a feminist, that the rise of the woman has significantly impacted men. And there are so many factors that need to be considered. The death by suicide is the biggest killer for men under the age of 45, and 50% of those who kill themselves have no mental illness. They actually just feel rejected. They feel that there's a lack of a sense of belonging. And the clarity over what it is to be a man is changing and evolving. There are mixed signals. You've got to be fit and strong. You've got to be the provider, but don't be the provider because women have got to earn the same, if not more than you. You need to have sex with as many women as you can, but actually know what women really want is for you to have sex with one and create stability. If you are angry, men aren't able to articulate and show any form of emotion that is anger because you're then evil. You can't talk about your success in the workplace because you only got the job because you're a male. And actually, let's put male privilege out there. So you can very easily and quickly see how men feel turned away from this conversation. So I'm fascinated. Let's start with male allyship, because I think this is where lots of organizations start, don't they? If you think about the journey that you've kind of been on, I'd be really interested to kind of hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, and I just want to tie back to this idea, we talked about this being a change program, is with any change program, you kind of need to think about all your stakeholders. So a lot of the change programs we've done that have been focused on women, we thought about women as a cohort, a set of personas that we need to find solutions for. But we haven't thought about the men, and we have to think about the persona and what their interest is, what their motivations might be, how they're currently feeling. We have to do that because they are part of the journey too. So and it's interesting that having co-founded a Male Allies program, that I'm now a little bit nervous about the word allyship. And I think the way we started out, if I'm brutally honest, and I think maybe I see similar with other allies programs, is that you're basically asking men to show up, to step up, if you like, and support women. And I think one of the interesting things, going back to one of the other points, is the fact that over the last 30, 50 years, if not longer, women have largely broken free of the stay-at-home mother female stereotype of the kind of 1950s 1960s era, and men have actually there have been a lot of men who've arguably played quite a critical role in that. But often I think for men as allies, the risk is they're seeing it as coaching, mentoring, sponsoring, training women, but only on how to succeed in the current culture. It's almost like we're kind of helping them adopt kind of the type of behaviors that men have utilized in order to become successful. And I think one of the interesting things about inclusion is the fact that it needs to address culture as its kind of core thing. And therefore, lots of programs that I've seen that have promoted greater representation of women, and like the Women in Technology program that I was part of at JP Morgan, they attract a lot more women into an organization, potentially promote a lot more women. But if the culture's not right, we tend to lose them really quickly. And we found that in technology at JP Morgan. I went to an energy sector conference recently, and the energy sector has got to hire a lot of people over the next 10 years in order to support the green transition. I mean, the estimate is at least 500,000 in this country. And yet already, having attracted loads of women over the past 5+ years to that sector, they're finding they're leaving faster than the men. Because it's not grounded in actually shifting that culture. So I think allyship is an important step. I do think, men putting their hand up and, going that extra mile for their female colleagues, whether it's around, a little bit of coaching, whether it's about mentoring. I mean, sponsorship, I think we would come on to that. All of these are critical things. But if they're not shifting the culture, then I think they're going to be much harder to stick. And I think that's one of the reasons we're hitting a bit of that brick wall. And we feel at Men for Inclusion, the step further, from the allyship is the people that are trying to change the culture too. And if you like, they're not just focused on, let's call it fixing the women, which is not a great kind of view view of the world, but around fixing the system
Yes.
and actually building a culture that actually it kind of works for everyone. You know, because some of the barriers women face, men do face them too. And if we can solve it for women, we can solve it for men as well.
And I think, I mean, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. And, you know, it's almost, if you like, a perfect segue into what I want to talk about next. But I think the experience that we see, and I'm sure you see as well when you're going to clients into this diagnostic stage, is they have set targets, and they either don't have a strategy of how to get there. So I worked with a client recently who had publicly announced targets for 2026. These targets had been set for 2 years. They set them in 2024. I rocked up in 2022. I rocked up in 2024 and said, great, okay, so what are we working for? What data points have we got? And what are we currently doing? What are our current interventions, if you like, or programs that we're currently working? Because they're clearly not working, but we need to figure out why. And I was met with a blank face, which is, well, we haven't got any interventions and programs or data points. So I think a lot of organizations jumped on a bit of a bandwagon, understood that they needed to publicly announce and take gender targets, but then lack the strategy to get there. So that's one camp of the clients we kind of help. The next camp is we've got programs, we've got initiatives, we've got a male ally group, we've got a female ERG, we've got, I don't know, maybe they look at promotion criteria, or they're attracting and building a female pipeline, let's say, especially in the kind of tech space. But then they come to, but it's not working. We are not moving the dial. And back to your point around this whole culture piece, when you've got a smaller cohort of senior leaders, albeit women, okay, all it takes is this domino effect to start happening. And then your numbers deplete very, very quickly, and you're going backwards, you're not going forwards. And I think that's something that we've got to be so mindful of, in terms of, it's not about attraction, it's about retention. And what makes women stay within organizations is that retention piece. So, you know, this is the work I was doing. Deep dive analysis and research, data points, putting the structure together, and then kind of Q stage, right, you come in, because I'm like, we need some innovative, forward thinking, change focus. We're going to talk about change management, change focus programs that we can tap into that are going to move the dial, because what we're currently doing, or what organizations are currently doing, isn't working. So talk to me about your journey, which got me hooked, and how and why Men for Inclusion really took form.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's really interesting, because I think one of the things that I've realized with my journey through this, and it started about 10 years ago. I mentioned I kind of co-found a Male Allies program, and it was through witnessing and being a sponsor of a Women in Technology program, and beginning to observe the fact that women were telling me about barriers that had frankly been completely invisible to me. And I think my motivation initially, I do think it's a motivator for a number of people, is just a simple kind of fair play one, right? You know, this is really not fair, right? Women are telling me about barriers they have that I clearly don't think their men have, and that it was very invisible to me as a leader, and therefore I realised I wasn't being the leader I wanted to be. So I think there's an element that you've got to kind of make sure that you understand that different lived experience. And I think I started out with that view that I'm doing this on behalf of women because, the barriers they face aren't right. What I'm beginning to realize now, 10 years later, is the fact that I think my position is shifting, and I'd like to think I'm now doing this for everyone. Because I firmly believe that gender equality benefits men. Lots of data points that are showing that. And there are some areas where there may be gender inequities that are affecting men. And I think you kind of opened up with some of those thoughts. Certain elements of health, for sure. Certain elements of education. I mean, girls have been outperforming boys at school for quite some years now. You see it in university academic studies, whatever it might be. So I do think there are places where men are not feeling that they have an equitable experience now as well, and I think we have to recognise that. So so I think that pivot in my head towards I need to do something to make the working lives of women better, to actually pivoting slightly towards I need to do something to make the working lives of everyone better, has certainly been the kind of journey I've been on. And to one of your points, the way in which we've approached a lot of diversity and inclusion programs today they've not been enticing for men. They've not been things that I mean, some men will, and some men have, the allies we talked about, and a huge credit to them. But for a lot of men, it's not been a positive experience. We've largely got them into rooms and said, you're privileged. I mean, is anyone being privileged? It's a word that immediately kind of people are going to kind of get their defenses up, and the hackles are going to rise. We've told them they're privileged. We've got them in the room to tell them they're biased, albeit in an unconscious way, that that they're aggressive, albeit in a micro way. And it kind of feel like we're saying it's all their fault, and actually I don't think it is their fault. I mean, not certainly consciously their fault. And we all live in a world that's kind of teaches us to be very kind of gendered in our thinking, right? So I think we haven't made it a welcoming space for those people, and because so many of them are still likely to hold those leadership positions, then we have to find ways of getting to them and having conversations where we listen to what they have to say. And I think a lot of them won't immediately open up, as you can imagine, but a lot of them are feeling that the world's somewhat against them now. They can see that, and you mentioned this actually. It's kind of, I see companies go, right, we will be 40% leadership in our executive ranks by 2025 with women. And that's it. It's full stop. That's the end of their communication strategy. I mean, music to lots of people's ears, but there's going to be a bunch of people in your organisation thinking, okay, so what does that mean for me? That doesn't sound quite so great to me. So I think if they are an important kind of set of stakeholders, we know some of them are not on board with this at all, and we can either ignore them or we can get rid of them. That's super expensive and really difficult. Or we can find ways to engage them and find reasons for them to want to be part of it. And I think if we can pivot to that inclusion piece about all of us, it's about improving our culture, and part of it is enabling a more meritocratic organisation to emerge. Because the minute people see, well, we've got a female empowerment program, we've got a female leadership program, we've got a female development program, but we haven't got any of those things for other demographics, that's not shouting meritocracy to me.
It's not. It's saying we are trying to focus and fix this problem. But you're right. And that's interestingly, that's feedback that I have received, having done an audit on this with a client. That was some of the feedback from some of the male voice, which and rightly so. We're talking about we're talking about fairness, rightly so. So talk to me about the work that Men for Inclusion does. And I mean, what I mean by that is, if I was to engage in your services and have you come in and work with my team, what would I expect? What could I expect? And what could I expect the outcome to be? Because I think, my logical brain kicks in here, as it always does with D&I. There's got to be an outcome. There's got to be something that we're measuring, and there's got to be an outcome.
And it's interesting actually, because you kind of talked about from the outset the kind of idea of targets and quotas and measure and representation, and actually I think any sensible organisation needs to understand their demographic. But I think we are trying to think in terms of inclusion, and therefore one of the things we have to figure out is a good way for you to measure inclusion within an organisation. And it's slightly different, because I don't know about what you're feeling, Sally. I don't think there's an absolute benchmark gold standard out there. I think there's kind of multiple different kind of approaches. One of the trends I think we're seeing in this space over the next 5 years is I think we'll see a bit of a convergence to a bit more of a standard. That may be driven through, I mean, certainly in the financial services world, they're looking at regulation and looking at reporting. So I could see something emerging from that. We start with this idea of a lived experience gap. So we often start with a little bit of research. It's based around the book I mentioned, The Accidental Sexist, which was also based on a 3-year research program at Cambridge University by one of our co-founders, Dr. Jill Armstrong. And that found 16, we call them accidental sexists, but 16 barriers that tend to affect women more than they affect men. Like things like being given all the admin, having your competency doubted, not being heard in meetings, a number of things. And that's not to say they don't happen to men, they do, but they just don't happen to as much. And we find about a 15, maybe 30% kind of lived experience gap. So that's one way which you could measure, are we being more inclusive? But you can see that it's tied to very real experiences. One of the things we always ask about is like, how well do you feel your performance is evaluated? We see a difference there, right? How good do you think, or how fair is your promotion processes? Again, we see a gap there, right? So they're all quite practical sort of difference spotting. So we start with that.
And just on that, sorry, and they're themed. So you can then see, not only can you ask the questions, which I think a lot of companies are scared to do. And also I find pushback in terms of, we're already surveying them about this. We're already asking them, well, you're not because you don't know the answer. So I always kind of push back on that. But sorry to interject there. The kinds of things that you come out with from doing that survey are really insightful, because it's all very well, I think, surveying, and asking people's opinion, but unless you're going to go off and do something with that and then embed change or change something, there's no point asking for the data in the first place. And I think what I love about your program is the themes that you then come out with, so you can then tackle that, if you like, as a pillar, as a D&I lead who want to then go and create a program off the back of it. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking, but carry on.
No, it's fine. but you're right. But also it's quite concrete. It's quite practical. It's kind of down to the real weeds of it, right? It's kind of literally asked, do you feel you're being asked to do more admin than your colleagues, right? I mean, and equally we ask, do you feel you get the same level of career enhancing opportunities as your colleagues, right? And again, we see that difference. And therefore, I'll give you a classic example, Sally. Like, do you feel that you are heard in meetings? 70% of women say no, or I struggle, right? But 40% of men say that too, right? So if you can solve that being heard in meetings problem, you're not only solving it for 70% of your women, you're solving it for 40% of your men, and that's a pretty chunky number as well.
Yeah.
So I think we start with that, and then we have a bit of a change program, which we call a juice. So we start with that awareness. The fact that there is this different lived experience, but also making it clear that it's not anyone's fault. It's why we use the phrase accidental sexism. It's kind of giving people a bit of an out. It's like, well, you just make a mistake, right? And if you're prepared to learn from that, and recognizing that actually most people are well-intentioned, we're not there to make other people's lives difficult in the workplace, but mistakes happen. So it's recognizing that we're all learning, we all make mistakes, and therefore part of the cultural change we're looking for is creating an environment where it's okay to make those mistakes, assuming we're willing to learn and we're ready to give each other kind of feedback when it happens. So it starts with that, so trying to make it, no blame attached. And then we kind of talk about, so what is it that can motivate people? And I've talked earlier about, when it comes to men, and not just men, I think more and more women are concerned about what's going to happen to their sons, maybe their partners. I've had a lot of women say to me, I'm not so worried about my daughter. I'm much more worried about my son and his kind of future. So you begin to have conversations with people that, how can you motivate people? How can we not make this a demotivating conversation? What are the things we can find that make it a positive conversation, a motivating conversation? So that can range from realizing the benefits that you as an individual get from working in a diverse and inclusive team, and there's lots of those. It can be about understanding that we are all diverse, and there could be something about you that makes you a unique, diverse individual, and that could be, for the outwardly straight white man, that could be something about neurodiversity. It could be something about socioeconomic background. There could be something that enables people to realise that uniqueness. It could be about simply the experience of the people close to you. A lot of men, get motivated because had daughters, or they see their wife going through a bad experience, or whatever it might be. So it's just trying to find the things that make this, frame it as a more positive thing to be doing, and how it's about trying to make work better for all of us. And then the second part, and we tend to break our what we do up into 3 parts. So first part is very much making sure we're all agreed what the problem statement is. And part of that, I think, just illuminate a little bit more. We have to recognise where people are on a journey, to understand that stakeholder group. And then when it comes to solutions, we have to kind of look at how we tackle that head on. If someone in our, we run a lot of workshops around it. If someone doesn't raise some point about positive discrimination within, we will force that conversation. If there's someone not in that room that's just thinking, what, I think this is all gone too far, right? This is all a bit too woke, or it's all about positive discrimination now. If someone will be thinking that, they may not voice it because it's often seen as career limiting to voice it. We need to open that conversation. I don't think anyone feels positive discrimination is a good thing. It's discrimination. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And therefore, people those things may be happening at a micro scale. They're not happening at a macro scale, because you can see that with the percentage of women in leadership, right? But at a micro scale, one manager making one decision to promote this particular person or hire, that could be happening, right? We've got to realise that could be reality, and we need to have those conversations.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the role of the middle manager is a really, really tricky one in an organisation. All blame lands on them, and I've seen it time and time again. I think when we talk about inclusive leadership capability, and something that I know that you're really keen on, and focus on Men for Inclusion, I think the argument is that it does benefit everyone. In order to be a leader in a world of work that is evolving so rapidly, and culture change that is going to continue to evolve, inclusive leadership is the only thing that is going to set you apart from someone else. But if organizations aren't investing in their leadership and management capability, what then happens at a micro level will continue to happen. And you said earlier, these things, it's not purposeful. People aren't intentionally making these decisions. And one of the quotes, and I'm going to put myself on the spot, normally I would write something out if I'm going to broadcast it, but it's that these things don't happen on purpose, but they don't happen by accident. And what I mean by that is the system that we all work in, okay, these things are happening because they are embedded in. So when you talk about people can't speak up at meetings, it's because the culture has been set by certain individuals, maybe the founders back in the day when this business was founded, okay? And they're then training and nurturing and growing their talent. And they're saying, well, I just need to behave like that. So therefore, this is what happens when you become into this role, or if you are able to raise your voice in meetings. And what I mean by not by volume, but by in terms of, captivating your audience, that shows leadership. And so this is just learned behavior that happens in hundreds and thousands and millions of companies all over the world.
Yeah.
But going back to the point that you talked about earlier, and I wrote something down, which is in terms of what it takes to be a man, that man allyship in the business. We're reaching out to women to teach them that this is how you need to get on in this culture. I'm so over female development programs that just teach women to act like men. I'm so over it. I'm over programs that are called fearless, like women are fearful, like don't get me on my soapbox on this, but I'm so beyond that. And actually, to the point, which is what this whole conversation is the forefront, it's not working. It's not working. So actually, if we're talking about really that inclusion conversation, and something that I want to go on to next, which is a change program. Now, you come from a change program background, okay?
Yeah.
What are the key elements of that contribute to a successful change program?
Yeah, I mean, and I think the starting point with that is you've got to recognise it's a change program. Yeah, and it sounds obvious, doesn't it? But I do feel a lot of D&I and kind of strategies, initiatives, or whatever, they don't look like that. They don't look like change programs, and you know, they often feel to me like a series of, you know, transactions connected to some sort of calendar of events, right? It's kind of like, you know, it's Women's History Month, Black History Month, you know, so therefore we do X, right? So it's just a series of things, and it, you know, it may not be a program that's kind of staffed and managed by change experts, and I think you need some change experts. We often kind of ask those type of programs to be kind of led by the people who have those diverse characteristics. We kind of set up all these groups, and they're usually led by someone from those groups who, I mean, they could be experienced change professionals, but they may not be, right? They could just be enthusiastic people with a stake who've got a desire and a purpose, and that goes a long way. But do they really have the skills that are going to affect change across the whole of the business, across the whole of the culture? So I do think that starting point is you have to, you know, make it look like a change program. You have to think about the investment, therefore, that goes into it. You know, money is always a question, and we'll probably get back to the kind of ROI conversation in a little while. But also, I think it's the investment of time and the recognition that, you know, your leaders and your managers will need time in order to, you know, properly invest in that culture. It should start with a proper stakeholder analysis. I mean, you know, what are the various kind of constituencies that need to be part of that change? What role do you need them to play? And, you know, the allyship question is an interesting one, right? Because that was a strategy. You know, we're saying, right, we're going to apply a role to a particular group, and we're going to ask them to do certain things. One of the things I see often with, certainly when allyship programs start, people are not really clear what you're asking people to do. You know, well, I need you to show up. I need you to be there. You know, and then what, right? So I think we need to be clear on what we're trying to do. And then the trickiest thing, going back to the change program, and I do think this is part of our change program, is that, like, how do you embed this into the way in which people operate, the way in which people do their jobs? So it's got to be a way in which there's things we can do that kind of continues to improve, and it lines it to the way in which people work. You sort of take it back to the way people operate. So we end up talking a lot about, you know, social interactions. How do you run the formal ones? How do you run meetings, and how do you ensure those voices are kind of heard and people aren't interrupted and all that kind of bad stuff? But also into the kind of more into social settings, because that's key. Yeah, there's lots of barriers, I think, for people around affinity biases in the workplace. So we need strategies that try to limit, you know, the way in which we can create sort of social cliques or social groups based around, you know, out of hours type activities, through to, we need to ask leaders, managers to think about, you know, how they're spending their informal social capital. You know, are they fairly spending their time with all of their kind of people in their team, as opposed to just the one or two people that they tend to have the most in common with? So I think it is multifaceted, but it starts with, like, you know, who are the people that we need to kind of take through this change journey, and what's the best way to do that? And actually, in my experience, the thing you need to think about is you do need kind of boots on the ground, if that's the right phrase. You need people kind of at a local level that are able to kind of steer that culture a little bit, I think.
And I think, back to the point that you made around, and we've seen a huge shift in people going into diversity and inclusion with a passion, with a specific lived experience. But I think as the world of D&I is evolving, and what we're, really helping a lot of our clients with at the moment is defining what exactly they want that role to do, and bringing it back to that change management conversation, because that's it. Without those skills, without the skills to be able to run an effective program with outcomes and influence on the way, it will fail. There's no two ways about it. It will just be seen as performative action. But I think if we look at a change management program, all the key elements that you would need for it to be successful: exec sponsorship, alignment to business strategy, a roadmap, investment, the skills to execute. And I think it's so easy in the D&I world, and we see so much backlash as soon as you put the word diversity on it. Everyone, for all the reasons we've spoken about in this live, turn off. Not for me, not interested, haven't got time. And this going back to this kind of middle management leadership piece, haven't got time. I'm focusing on sales. I'm focusing on revenue. I haven't got time to focus on this. But what they mean by that is I haven't got the capability, and therefore I don't want to spend my time doing it. So I think it's really important, before you go into any of this work, before you hire a D&I lead, before you consult with, is think, right, are we going to give this the same focus and attention and investment as we were if we were changing our CRM?
Exactly.
Would we? Are we going to give it the same focus, attention, and investment if we were going to go out and work with a PR company, recruit a head of marketing, whatever? But I think I want to quickly, and I'm conscious of time, like I said, I could talk about you all afternoon, is ROI. What is the return of investment from your experience? And actually, what I do want to just ask you about as well, just quickly, because we've got this kind of this is the change program, okay? And then you talk about what you can then do to ensure that kind of continuous improvement, which we would need to do with the culture piece of work anyway. We spoke the other day, and you talked to me about some work you're doing with a couple of your clients in terms of embedding and upskilling these individuals who aren't, and sorry, I was going full circle on this, who aren't the people who sit on the D&I committee. They're not the EDI sponsors in the business. They are individuals that are embedded in teams. And what role do you think that we need them to do?
And it's really interesting, and I think there are kind of multiple versions of this in some ways, but I think we are looking to build what we call inclusion leaders, and doesn't mean to say you're in a leadership position per se, but you are able to help others with their inclusive behaviours. And another point I think I'd like to make, going back to that kind of challenge for the middle manager, for most of us, when we go into work each day, we can't actually do that much about diversity. It's not like we're hiring every single day, we're promoting every single day, but we can do something about inclusion every single day, right? Inclusion is like a muscle that it needs regular exercise, right? So what we're encouraging people to do is to go into work and exercise your inclusion muscle, and that could be lots of simple stuff around noticing the in-out groups and bringing people into conversations. It could be lots of small kind of things that kind of really kind of add up. So what we're looking to do is find people that are kind of willing to do that. And I do think there's a role for leadership, undoubtedly. We tend to end up, what we find is kind of create almost like two cohorts in a way. The first is what you always kind of like inclusion role models. So these are the more senior people in the business. They haven't got time to be down in the weeds, as you can imagine. However, they need to align their behaviours to the overall kind of values, if you like, of the organisation, because obviously inclusive leadership usually has very strong alignment to whatever kind of values and behaviours that you as a company are championing. So we end up spending time ongoing kind of coaching, if you like, with those kind of senior leaders, just to kind of talk them through. So what is it? What should I be doing as a senior leader, as a role model, to promote these inclusive behaviors? Because I think the minute the people below that spot that slight inauthenticity gap for what you're saying as a business versus what you do as a leader, then it becomes very difficult to influence the rest of the organization. And that can be, again, lots of simple stuff. The way in which do you send emails to your team after certain times? I mean, I know it's about to be made illegal in France, for example, but there's sort of small stuff. Yes, there's small stuff around how you set the tone as a leader. So that's kind of one cohort. And then what we're finding, and we're doing more and more of this, is we kind of almost like embed. It's not unlike, I don't know, a lot of companies done like mental health first aiders. It's not someone unlike that. It's inclusion coaches or inclusion champions, but people that can affect culture at a local level, right? So they're kind of there, with having gone through some more extended kind of learning, and with a strong encouragement to continue that learning, because we're all learning here. But they're kind of checking on, are we doing this inclusively? Are we making decisions in an inclusive way? Are we making sure that everyone gets opportunities? Are we ensuring that our social events are available to all? All those kind of small stuff. So it's those people that have kind of got the high-vis jacket, that are there to hopefully seen as kind of like the local person that's supporting everyone. Because this isn't easy stuff.
No.
We talk about this. It was easy. We would have kind of figured it out decades ago. And it's people that can maybe are facilitating some of those more difficult conversations.
Yeah, and the skills to do so. And I think this also, I mean, I did want to talk to you about kind of mentorship versus sponsorship, because I think as we are defining what the leaders of the next generation, and I say that in terms of we need them now, what do we need from leadership within our organizations to get the return on investment of it's even a return on investment, it's to ensure that we continue to develop as organizations. If we're not doing anything, if we're not focusing on culture, we're not just standing still, we're going backwards. If we're not focusing on leadership capability, we're not standing still, we're going backwards. And so I think what I love about that kind of inclusion champion or inclusion coaches is actually, is this something that we should be embedding in all leadership roles and leadership competencies? And we talk about mentorship versus sponsorship. You talked earlier about allyship or turning up, or exec sponsor sponsoring LGBTQ+, or what do you want me to do? Be present, show up. Whereas actually, I think that we feel the same. I think mentoring programs are really effective, really, really effective. But when we're talking about turning the dial, making an impact, having this piece around sponsorship and sponsoring others, and understanding that as a competency as a leader for underrepresented groups, I'm not talking about diversity, but talking about underrepresented groups, what impact do you think that can have on an initiative and program like this?
Yeah, I think there's a reasonable amount of research from a gender perspective showing that sponsorship will increase the number of female leaders far more than mentoring will. I think that's because I think it's a far more deliberate thing, isn't it? The outcome's very, very clear, and I think usually good sponsorship programs have made the goals clear, and the way in which you achieve that goal is often reasonably much more clarified. Whereas mentoring, I think there's a number of different outcomes you might be looking at for a mentoring program, because I think it comes down to the individual and for them to set the expectation of what they want out of that program. So I think it's a strong change force. I think again, the more you can make it multifaceted, the better. It's not just one particular group, but actually it's a program of work that can actually enable many different career kind of opportunities to be seized. I also think, just going back, and I don't think I really necessarily answered your question or your point about ROI. I think part of this is this feeling that this should be something that you try to align to whatever other core business metrics you tend to look at regularly, right? I mean, so there is research that can connect this to financial performance.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly research that can connect this to staff engagement,
okay,
massively, and your retention stats and your attraction as an employer, and actually discretionary effort and level of collaboration, level of innovation. I think again, there's lots of research that can measure this. So I do think connecting it to some of those things is super helpful. And also just generally your risk profile as a business, right? There's a huge amount of risk associated with getting this wrong, increasing risk, one would argue. So, and you kind of mentioned that if you're not totally investing in your culture, then, culture can degrade. And we've seen that with companies having some fairly major issues with it. I kind of like this definition of culture. Culture is the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. Yeah. I mean, that's it goes back to leadership. What behaviors do we allow leadership to get away with? So I think it's there are many levers, and I think sponsorship, mentoring are two of those levers. But again, I think the overall framing needs to be, what are the things we want to measure, and can we connect them to our business performance? Yeah. I think that would be how I would be thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you run this program internally, or do you get external support to come and do it for you? Get the experts in, Gary. Give Gary a call would be my first bit of advice. We've completely run out of time. Yeah. I was going to go through the three key takeaways, but I will do that in some kind of blog or something and post it out or do some snippets. But genuinely, Gary really enabled me to have different conversations with my clients in terms of what some of the solutions could look like in this space. I think the reality is these targets, whether you agree with targets or not, the targets aren't going away. There's going to be the time is ticking, I think, is what I want to say, in terms of if you have publicly announced targets, there is going to, and because we're still in the first raft of those happening. We're going to start seeing a shift in terms of, okay, what are the penalties going to be if you don't hit them? And we've just talked about the ROI in terms of the impact it can have, especially on sustainability, investment, things that I appreciate boards are really find really important and high on their agenda list. So the pressure is going to, the reality is that these targets are not going to get scrapped. Okay, there's going to be the reasons to why you're not hitting them are going to be under more scrutiny, and companies of smaller sizes are going to be expected to start publishing them, along with disability gap analysis, along with race and gap analysis. So this is not a problem that's going to go away. My pledge to you all, my plea to you all is, please stop burying your head in the sand. Let's do some diagnostic work, figure out what's going on, engage with Gary. I've got a white paper that's coming out on this shortly. So if you want a copy of my white paper, slide into my DMs, drop a note on here, share this far and wide. But yeah, let's start tackling this problem and start moving the dial. Gary, thank you. Hang on, where are you? Are you going to China soon? Have I made that up?
I'm going to Korea.
Really, I knew I was going to say China and you were going to say Korea. Apologies. Yeah. So what are you doing in Korea? Tell us really quickly, and then I'll say goodbye to everyone.
Last year I was invited to speak at their first ever gender equality conference. I should explain who they are. So UN Women set up a center of excellence for gender equality in South Korea probably about 4 or 5 years ago now. Last year was their first conference because of COVID. So they hadn't been able to establish that. I was one of their guests amongst quite a few guest speakers, talking about allyship, talking about the role of men, I think, in gender equality. This year, amazingly, they've invited me back. So it wasn't a complete disaster last year. That's always good. And this time they've given me a little bit more time. We're kind of running a little bit more of a workshop-y type thing. Again, I think the big part of that will be exploring, a little bit about the barriers perhaps to men getting more involved, the recognition of the benefits to men of gender equality, and a little bit about, what can we start doing about it.
Fantastic. I can't wait to hear all about it. Hopefully you're going to post all about it on LinkedIn. We need to see more of your face on this lovely platform. But genuinely, I'm grateful that our paths have crossed. You have enriched my knowledge in this subject so much, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm looking forward to the next opportunity for us to collaborate. So thank you.
Thanks, Sally. It's been a real pleasure working with you and meeting you as well. I've learned lots. So.
Take care. See you soon, everyone.